Jim Coutts served as Pierre Trudeau's chief of staff during some of his most turbulent years as prime minister. It's been said that he not only knew everyone and saw everything, he wrote it all down. Now, nearly a dozen years after his death, his secret diaries are finally being made public. Here to talk about the Coutts Diaries, power, politics, and Pierre Trudeau, 1973 to 1981, is editor Ron Graham. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Congratulations on the book, Ron. The story of how it came to be is almost as interesting as what's inside it. How did you come to be involved?
Well, I knew that Jim had kept diaries. Nobody had ever seen them before, maybe a couple pages, a couple of people, but they were sort of these mythic things that he used to talk about. And so I heard through the grapevine from friends at University of Toronto that they were going to be opened in January of 25, which is remarkably quick after somebody's death. Usually it's 25 years or 50 years. And we're not quite sure why Jim put such a quick turnaround, particularly since many of the people in the book are still alive. But anyway, I got a update or a heads up that they were going to go public. I went to the executor. I said, can I take a look at them to see how good they are? Nobody knew I didn't know whether they were going to be full sentences, they were going to be notebooks, they were going to be messages to himself. I had no idea what the quality of them were. And they're what I've discovered, they actually begin in 65. They go on after 81, but in a more sort of notebooky, haphazard way. But the material from 73 to 81, I found really, really compelling. So I got permission to look at them. I got permission to prepare them for publication as quickly as possible after the opening date. And here they are.
You were surprised at how quick they allowed the diaries to be made public, but why all the secrecy in the first place? Are the contents that damaging?
They're not so much damaging as they are the inside of cabinet meetings. Obviously, the people at the time were very much alive, and some of them were still in the political game. And so he kept these it's mysterious. I don't think he was planning them as a memoir or to use them. He never looked at them again. And I think he had this idea, sort of a British tradition. We don't have it much in Canada, that you're sort of the stenographer to history. You're just recording it as it was. So every day, despite these grueling days, he would either write them into notebooks or dictate them, and in a very detailed way. So there's actually, I know, more than a million words probably. And what I had to do was to go through them and find the meat of them, particularly on certain important themes. But for every on one day, if I talk about two meetings, he's had seven, and he records them in as much detail.
Now, the book contains some very frank assessments of not only his boss, but John Turner, Jean Chrétien, and Paul Martin Jr., who we learn wanted to be the leader of the Liberal Party as early as 1980. What were some of the highlights for you?
I think that's well, you've hit them. The interesting thing is Jim had a reputation of being, he was cherubic and fun and just great company, but he also had a dark side, and he could be quite mean and tough, and that was part of his reputation. So I think people were expecting some really tough analysis of others. And certainly that's what I was expecting, I guess. And what happened was that I found that his judgment was very close to accurate. If you knew these people he was talking about, yeah, that's it. Yeah, they have these qualities, but yeah, they have these defects. And he was quite he was quite balanced in that way. So yeah, he took digs at people, but he wasn't either mean-spirited or inaccurate in my experience. And that was that allowed me to put these on because put these in. I didn't have to cut anything, even about Pierre Trudeau's marriage and Jim's love affair with Jennifer Ray. I didn't have to, except for maybe an adjective here or there, which I thought could be a little unfair or a little embarrassing. Basically, I was able to do a warts and all in the diaries.
Now, the book spans the period from 1973 to 81, as you mentioned, but the mother lode of the diaries are 6 volumes covering 1979, 80, and the first half of 81. What were sort of the highlights for you there? Because there's a lot of history that happens, especially in those 3 years I just mentioned.
Yeah, well, it was interesting because the 77, 70, 78, 70 was turned out to be missing altogether because he didn't write it, which was a frustration. I found a couple of dates, but basically nothing. 78, the government is heading towards an election. And what was interesting reading it, it felt a lot about what we've been going through the last couple of years with Justin Trudeau. Should he go? Should he stay? Is a defeat inevitable? And basically, you saw his father going through exactly the same debate with exactly the same uh, advice. You'll probably lose this one. You're sinking. Maybe I should go, says Trudeau. I've got my kids, etc. I've got my marriage problems. So he eventually stays, loses the election, and resigns. And then perhaps the most powerful and historically important period is when Coutts, basically by himself, convinces Trudeau to come out of retirement, to bring down the government of Joe Clark, and to fight the 90 election. And of course, that led to the fighting of the referendum. It led to the charter. It led to the NDP. And there's a pivotal moment where it looked like Pierre Trudeau was going to announce his resignation, that he would not be running in 80. And Coutts goes over to Stornoway in the morning and basically spends an hour with him and convinces him to put his hat back in the ring. And it's dramatic stuff because it had epic consequences for the Canada we're living in now.
And I think this kind of speaks to the kind of guy that Coutts must have been, because the book is hardly a passive observer recording events. It's as the quote goes, he exercised more backroom power than anyone else in modern Canadian history. But he also didn't like that reputation either. Can you expand upon that? He didn't like being called Machiavelli, masquerading as a sheriff, for instance.
Sure. It's interesting because there are a lot of people go back to see Jim Coutts as the original sinner in terms of the centralization of the PMO. And the book suggests that there's some truth to that, that he used his power. He had extraordinary access to the prime minister every day. He had extraordinary access to the ministers, to the cabinet, to every meeting going on, to every policy, to every bureaucracy. And he was there. And he exercised it. Sometimes the most fantastically, I suppose, was when he got a $2 billion cut in the budget without telling the Minister of Finance, and over the objections of the Clerk of the Privy Council. And he did that basically single-handedly. So he was not shy about using his power. So that built a lot of resentment around him from the cabinet and the caucus. And also he became it's a classic thing. Every principal secretary up till Justin's had the same problem with people trying to get to the prime minister, attack the prime minister, bring the prime minister down. They're too afraid to do it themselves, or it's too dangerous. So they go after the principal secretary. And Coutts knew that reputation. And to an extent, he lived with it. But it cost him big time by the end of his career, because he lost when he tried to run for parliament. He lost twice, and probably because his public reputation was both too high for a backroom guy and also too controversial.
Now, how does a guy like this even find his way into the prime minister's office? As you point out, he was born in High River, Alberta, in 1938, and the quote I like: "Being a liberal in Alberta was hardly the easiest path to success. Yet there he is, becomes principal secretary at only the tender age of 37."
Mm. Well, it's even more remarkable than that, because he actually joined the office of Prime Minister Pearson when I think he was like 21 or 20. And because he looked like a boy, and because Pearson sort of looked like a boy too, Pearson always joked that the country will think that it's being run by my son. And Jim, I don't know quite, it's mysterious why he got the liberal bug, but it was early. It was the time of John Kennedy. Liberalism was more interesting. He was sort of intellectual. And so even though it wasn't a sure, easy road, he got the party early. He ran twice, very, very young. I think he was 18 or 19 when he first ran. He lost, of course, a couple of times. But then, because he was bright and funny and president of the Young Liberals, he got an entree or an introduction to Pearson, who immediately hired him onto his chief of staff. and became very close to Pearson and Keith Davey and that early gang of the 60s. And then when Trudeau comes in, that gang was pushed out, and Coutts went out with them, went to Harvard, became an MBA, earned some money, made some business contacts. And then when Trudeau almost sank in 72, he realized, I better get some pros in here. And so he invited Coutts and Davey, a couple of others, back from basically exile to run his office. But as the book shows, the first couple of years, 73, 74, it was touch and go whether they would connect. And then when Coutts and gang won the 74 election, the famous Margaret election, his star was bright, and he came in that way. And you say he was still only young, but at that point he'd already been in there for 15 years or something.
Now, as mentioned, Coutts plays a central role in the Trudeau years. What do the diaries tell us about his role in the repatriation of the Constitution? And I ask this because your earlier book, The Last Act, is all about that. Is there enough in these diaries to make you want to revise or revisit what you wrote in that book?
Not so much. Well, there's more detail, but what's interesting is that Coutts was basically frozen out or kept out of the Quebec agenda totally. It was both the party machine and the policymakers were people like Lalonde and Jean Marchand and Trudeau himself and the gang, and they controlled that quite tightly. So Jim was in the meetings, and his notes about the beginnings of the Trudeau formula, about how are we going to win the referendum, what did it look like in the middle referendum, how do we come out, how do we sell this thing? That's all new material and quite gripping in its detail. It was more the prelude because Jim wasn't around when the actual Night of the Long Knives, quote unquote, happened. So he wasn't a direct player. And what's interesting to me, his turf was Ontario and the West. And he was very worried even about Trudeau's bilingualism policies. He thought they were pushing too far. He thought Trudeau should have concentrated more on the economy. The economy was in hell those years. And it's interesting that Trudeau actually was more patient with that criticism because normally he didn't like that. He was so obsessed with what he wanted to do. So Jim wasn't in the Quebec agenda much, except that he does record Trudeau's thinking and how it evolved to get to the point where it was going to be unilateral patriation with the charter.
Now, we were talking about parallels earlier between Coutts's time and our own, and I noticed there's mention of postal strikes, Canada-U.S. relations, changes in the White House, the economy. The part that stuck out to me, though, was John Turner quitting cabinet in 1975 because he didn't feel close to Trudeau, and it reminded me of all the ministers who quit Justin Trudeau's cabinet for much the same reason. Jody Wilson-Raybould, Marc Garneau, the list goes on and on and on. And I thought it was interesting that father and son had a hard time getting close to their ministers or being open to them.
Right. Well, it's interesting because some of the recent examples, part of the problem is, if you live as long as I have, you go from being a journalist to an historian. You have to sit there. And I could watch some of these people like Bill Morneau, and you'd say, "Oh, if you had known the John Turner story, you would not be doing what you're doing, or you'd be doing it differently." And it's one of the interesting things about these diaries, I think, is they're 50 years old. And in 1970, nobody was reading diaries from 1920. I mean, it's interesting. But these have a freshness to them. I compare it sort of like a early Joni Mitchell album, which is also 50 years old. But it has sort of, because the names are familiar, the issues are familiar, these repetitions, you're learning things, that it actually had sort of a freshness. And the extraordinary thing about the Turner exchange was that Trudeau asked to see Jim's diaries within a day or two of Jim writing them, the resignation of Turner. And then in the margins, Trudeau records his own memories of what the inside meetings were all about. And then the next day, Coutts has lunch with Turner and gets his side of the story fresh. So it's the type of material that at the time, if you were a journalist, and even now as an historian, your jaw sort of drops about how rich this stuff is and how pertinent it is to now. My hope is that people will read it and see it as a masterclass of what to do or not to do in government because it's all there. The mistakes are the same, the successes are the same, the issues are the same, and how you stick handle through them or not. It's all there. It's all in our history, and we're doomed if we don't remember our history.
Let's talk legacies of Jim Coutts, and we touched upon this a little bit earlier, but chief among them is how he centralized power away from cabinet, MPs, and even the public service into the PMO, and it seems we're still living with that today.
Yeah, I think that's right. And now it's partly, again, it's interesting because one of the things that surprised me in the book was Jim's disdain might be too hard a word, but his basically lack of respect for the cabinet ministers and even the chief civil servants. He just felt that they weren't working hard enough, they weren't being strategic enough, they were doing petty turf wars, they were going down dead end alleys, and it was so frustrating to him. And he was a very activist guy. It was an activist period. He believed that activism would be the road to political success because people liked activism. I mean, Canadians wanted governments to act, and Trudeau did least well when he wasn't acting, particularly in the mid 70s. So Jim was an activist, and he got very frustrated with the other ministers and the chief civil servant, as did Trudeau, which is why he basically rammed through the charter strategy over the heads of even he goes on and on, Trudeau, in the book about the senators betrayed them, the caucus members who chickened out, the people around him. So yes, that is a legacy, and whether it's probably not a good legacy, but when you get into power, it's really interesting to see what Carney is doing now. And again, I'm not a close observer, but you see parallels of somebody who has an agenda, who's determined to push it through. It's sort of a vision. It's not sure that the rest of the cabinet or the civil servant is with them on many of these issues. But if he really wants to push them through, then the strategic prime minister and the centralized as PMO becomes the way he does it. Probably not a good thing, but the other thing side of that, John, is the attention to polling, which is sort of amazing. I mean, they're watching it every day, and we follow the ups and downs. One day they're up, and the next day they're down, and one day they're going to have an election, and the next day they'll cancel the election, all based on these rolling polls across the country. And Coutts is studying them like you study tea leaves or something, or more importantly, he believes they're real. And that was dramatic, and that became the beginning of that. Now, because of media, polling isn't quite as important, or there's different ways to read the public mood. But at that time, it was the only way to read the public mood, and the public mood was volatile. And it affected, seemed to be like every decision, political and policy wise.
By the end of the book, I feel that Coutts seems like something of a sad figure. There's plenty of attention paid to his unrequited love of Jennifer Ray, a lot written about his late night poker games, the wins and the crushing losses, and the dollar figures. I have to remind myself, we're talking about 1980. So
Right.
losing a couple of grand now would not be great, but 40 years ago, adjusted for inflation anyway. And of course, as we talked about, his failed attempts to become an MP after being chief of staff. How, all of this being said, how do you think he should be remembered?
Well, I think the book redeems him in the sense in the sense of what his values are and what he was trying to do. That he wasn't just a manipulative party guy. He actually had, I mean, there was that side, but he actually connected the two with what was good for the country and how the country worked. And I think there's a legacy of liberalism. And maybe that liberalism and a vision of activist liberalism seems to be ancient history now, but he articulates that, as does Pierre Trudeau and the people around him, in a way that it's almost lost now. The world was so different then. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that he's remembered as a sort of a political backroom manipulator, election guy. But the book makes clear how smart he was. He was a Harvard Business School guy. He was a business man. And when he gets into taking on finance officials or oil patch executives or the other cabinet ministers on wage and price controls or housing problem or energy prices or just name it, uh, it's very, very deeply thought out, articulated, and often effective. So I think the policy side surprised me because I'd always associate him as a party guy. But in fact, he had a vision of the country that was a mixed economy where we have to be a mixed economy. And again, it's like ancient history now with a breakdown between business and Ottawa. But in those days, he would find a few business leaders who understood that they go to Ottawa just not to feather their own nest, but to do something that was good for the country. And he had enough of those, and he worked at it because he had a vision of the economy and how Canada worked. And I think that's an impressive legacy, and also makes him a more finally in history, a more important player in terms of his impact on policy as well as politics. And perhaps if he only did one thing in his whole career, that decision to that fight to get Trudeau to reverse his reluctance to fight in 1980 would have made Jim Coutts's reputation for the rest of history because art history changed with that conversation.
I was struck at how ready Trudeau was to call it a day. It's like, well, that's it. That's the career. And obviously hindsight being 2020. No, there's more. You have to come back. You have to
Yeah.
stay.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the 70s were a tough time. It was a tough time to govern. His marriage was falling apart. His kids were young. There was his agenda of bilingualism. The charter was going nowhere. Alberta was acting up. It was just a hard period. And as it makes all the way through, he's sort of a really reluctant politician. I mean, some of the detail of how ornery he was with the media, with the party executive. I mean, just Coutts is always dragging him out by the scruff of the neck to go to some really important Ontario Liberal convention or something. And he's just saying, really, do I have to? I hate these people. I've got nothing to say for them. They're all idiots. So it's really hard work, but he was an intellectual. He was a loner. His loneliness comes out as much as Coutts's, I think. And caught in this game with a big vision of something he had to do. And then by the time he leaves in 79 or resigns, he hadn't done it. And he was a really unhappy guy. And he probably would have quite happily gone to the country then and raised his kids, who were still very young, as a single parent. But then the temptation to come back and try and not be looked like a quitter and to try one more time to do it. And that coming back from the dead, it was like Scrooge on Christmas morning. He suddenly thought, this time I'm going to do it. And I don't care what the hell happens to me because I'm leaving anyway. So it's a remarkable, and again, you make parallels when the media speculates on what Justin's been talking about for the last 2 years. Have those debates been going on in his homes too in the middle of the night? Are there people saying get out, and there are people saying stay in, and what are you staying for? And these are I think, John, in summary, what impressed me most about this and why I think it's an important book for all Canadians is that these people come off to me as very, very human. They're not super people. They're the egos and vanities and indecisions and late night poker games and alcohol and women problems and marriage problems and this is like a leitmotif. Aged parents in Alberta, uh, ostracized by your own community there, and goes back to Alberta to be abused, and he's got to deal with that. And of course, as you say, the epic ending where he loses badly because he's become a pariah in his own party. These I found really human people, and the detail makes them really human people. And I think that's refreshing for us to know that these people who are governing us are just ordinary people, or maybe extraordinary people, but caught with a lot of really ordinary neuroses.
Ultimately, what do you hope people take away from the book?
I think two things. One would be that uh, government is hard. It's boring, it's tedious, it's my risk as a writer would be how not to make these passages, which can be really nerdy at times, too boring or too repetitive. But the reality is that we're in the kitchen of government here. You actually see how these things work. You see the problems. You see just as when you're dealing with one thing, something else hits you. And it's very, very hard, complicated, tough work. And if you think that our politicians can solve something easily, or that government is a bunch of ill-willed people, or they should be more efficient, or all those things, I think I'd like people to come away with, okay, there's some respect for the system here. These people are working hard, and they're not always to feather their own nest. That's one thing. And then I think the second thing is the humanity of it. To me, it almost reads like a novel. You have this guy who comes out of a small town, Alberta, lower middle class, bright, but running for a party that is anathema there. Takes himself up by his bootstraps and his wit, his brains. He was an incredibly charming guy. Into the highest realms. He's socializing with the billionaires. He's going to shoots in Texas, and it's a pretty giddy high life. He's developing an art collection. He's a gardener. He's got this romance going. Turns out it's the only one I could get into the book, um, and and yet this tragic ending. So where the diaries, John, end the day he leaves Ottawa to go to run in Spadina. They just stop. And so it's like he fell off the cliff. And it's the humanity of the story, of the novel arch, of somebody coming up, rising, falling, that gives real drama, even though the content can seem quite nerdy.
The name of the book is The Coutts Diaries, Power, Politics, and Pierre Trudeau, 1973 to 1981. It is published by Sutherland House. My thanks to editor Ron Graham.
Thank you for your time.